July 26, 2013. The last Ford Transit rolled off the line at Swaythling, Southampton. The workers who built it signed their names on the bodywork. Then the machines went quiet for the first time in 40 years. At its peak, this plant employed 4,500 people. It built more than 2 million vans. For nearly half a century, it produced the best-selling commercial vehicle in British history. A van so woven into the fabric of everyday life that Ford called it the backbone of Britain. The Transit did not fail. The plant did not go bankrupt. Ford Motor Company, in the year it closed Southampton, made a global profit of $2.2 billion. So why did the last van ever assembled in Britain roll out of a Hampshire factory on a summer morning in 2013 and never come back? The answer is not foreign competition. It is not automation. It is not a product that fell out of fashion. It is a story about broken promises, cheap labor, and a corporation that used British taxpayers' money to build the factory that replaced us. This is the story of Ford Southampton. February 2nd, 1939. The mayor of Southampton stood before a brand new factory on Wide Lane, Swaythling, and declared it open. The building was clean, modern, and purposeful. Outside, Europe was 7 months from war. The factory had been built for Cunliffe Owen Aircraft, a British manufacturer contracted to assemble aircraft components on the northeastern edge of Southampton. It sat on 44 acres beside the city's airport, a deliberate choice. Planes could be rolled directly from the factory floor onto the runway. The site was compact, efficient, and strategically positioned. Nobody imagined it would still be running 74 years later. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, the factory transformed overnight. Cunliffe Owen's supply chain switched entirely to the war effort. The workshops that had assembled civilian aircraft components were retooled for something far more urgent: parts for the Supermarine Spitfire, the single-engine fighter that would define the Battle of Britain. In the years that followed, the Swaythling factory moved beyond components entirely. By the later stages of the war, whole Spitfires were being assembled on its floor. The Germans noticed. In September 1940, Luftwaffe bombers targeted the factory for the first time. They came back. The site was hit on multiple occasions, a testament not to poor aim, but to how seriously the enemy took what was being built there. Workers arrived each morning not knowing whether the building would still be standing. They built anyway. The factory kept running. It is worth pausing on that detail. The plant at Swaythling survived direct bombing raids during the most destructive air campaign ever waged over British soil. The machines kept moving. The Spitfires kept coming. That resilience was not accidental. It was structural, cultural, and deeply local. The people of Southampton understood what they were building and why it mattered. That sense of purpose would carry the factory through the decades that followed. The war ended in 1945. The Spitfire contracts dried up. By 1947, Cunliffe Owen Aircraft was in receivership, a casualty of the abrupt peacetime collapse in aviation orders that bankrupted dozens of British manufacturers. The factory on Wide Lane fell quiet for the first time. It did not stay quiet long. In 1949, an American company called Briggs Motor Bodies purchased the site. Briggs was a supplier of pressed steel body panels to Ford of Britain, and the Southampton plant, large, well-equipped, and conveniently located near the port, suited their purposes exactly. The factory was reborn as a stamping and body assembly operation, feeding panels and pressings to Ford's vehicle plants elsewhere in the country. Then, in 1953, Ford bought Briggs outright. With that single acquisition, Ford gained control of the 630,000 square foot facility at Swaythling. It was not a dramatic moment. No ceremony, no headlines. Ford absorbed the plant the way large corporations absorb smaller ones, quietly, efficiently, and with an eye on what the asset could do for the balance sheet. The factory was retooled again, this time specializing in truck and van body assemblies, shipping completed bodies to Ford's chassis plant in Slough, Berkshire, where they were mated with running gear and finished vehicles dispatched to dealers. For 12 years, that was the rhythm of Swaythling. Bodies out, trucks built elsewhere, the factory one link in a chain that stretched across southern England. Competent. Unremarkable. Entirely unaware of what was coming. In 1965, Ford launched a van that would change everything. The Ford Transit was not an accident of engineering. It was the result of a deliberate company-wide directive from Henry Ford II himself. A clean slate van designed for the whole of Europe, drawing on the combined knowledge of Ford's British and German divisions. Codenamed Project Redcap, it launched in Britain in October 1965, built initially at Ford's Langley plant in Berkshire. The bodies, however, came from Swaythling. Every transit body shell was fabricated at Southampton, loaded onto trucks, and driven up to Langley, where it was dropped onto a chassis and finished. It was an inelegant arrangement, expensive in transport costs, vulnerable to delays, dependent on two sites running in perfect synchrony. Ford knew it could not last. What they needed was a single facility capable of building the entire van, from raw steel to finished vehicle, under one roof. In 1972, they chose Southampton. Ford of Britain invested £5 million in the Swaythling plant, a substantial commitment for the era. New presses, new assembly lines, new paint facilities. When the work was complete, Southampton became the sole site in Western Europe capable of producing the complete Ford Transit from start to finish. The first van off the new line was handed to the mayor of Southampton, who donated it to a local charity. It was a gesture that captured something true about the relationship between the factory and the city. This was not a distant corporate operation. It was Southampton's own. What followed was the factory's golden era. Through the 1970s and into the mid-1980s, demand for the transit grew relentlessly. Builders, plumbers, electricians, delivery drivers, market traders, ambulance services, police forces, the transit became the default answer to the question of how Britain moved things and people. Ford leaned into the identity. The van was marketed as the backbone of Britain, and the phrase stuck because it was accurate. On any given weekday morning, the white van in the lay-by, the panel van outside the building site, the minibus outside the school, the odds were overwhelming that it came from Swaythling. At its peak, the factory employed 4,500 people. Production reached 75,000 vehicles annually, with half of every transit built at Southampton exported across Europe. The plant ran on 2 full shifts. The car parks were full before dawn. The canteen served hundreds of meals a day. Entire neighborhoods in Swaythling and the surrounding areas drew their wages from Wide Lane. Fathers, sons, brothers, whole streets tied to the same factory gates. On July 25, 1985, the 2 millionth Ford Transit rolled off the Southampton production line. It was a milestone that meant something. Not just as a number, but as a statement of what a single British factory, staffed by ordinary working people in a Hampshire suburb, had managed to build in 13 years of full production. 2 million backbones of Britain. 2 million vans carrying the economy on their axles. David Higgins started on the assembly line in 1979, welding body shells in Building B. He would stay for 30 years, moving between buildings, learning the rhythms of the line, watching colleagues retire and new faces arrive. For him, and for thousands like him, the factory was not simply a place of employment. It was a vocation, a community. The thing that gave the neighborhood its identity and its income. Nobody on that floor in 1985, watching the 2 millionth van roll past, had any reason to imagine it would end. But the factory had a problem it could not solve. And it had nothing to do with the vans. The site at Swaythling was, by any measure, awkward. When Cunliffe Owen chose the location in 1939, it was open land on the edge of the city, with easy access to the airport and room to expand. By the 1980s, that openness had been swallowed by 40 years of urban growth. The factory found itself boxed in on every side. To the north, the M27 motorway, completed in 1983, cut the plant off permanently from Southampton Airport, severing the last open boundary. To the west, a railway line. To the east, a graveyard. To the south, the airport perimeter fence. There was nowhere to go. Every other major vehicle assembly plant in Britain, Longbridge, Dagenham, Halewood, had land to grow into, room to reconfigure, space to build modern facilities alongside existing ones. Southampton had none of that. When Ford needed to expand the paint shop in the 1980s, engineers faced a choice between building outward, which was impossible, and building upward. They built upward. The paint facility rose 6 stories into the Hampshire sky, a vertical production line that was unique in European automotive manufacturing, an ingenious solution to an impossible constraint. It worked. But it was a warning. A factory that cannot expand cannot modernize at scale. New tooling requires new floor space. New model introductions require reconfigured lines. The Transit was evolving. New engines, new variants, new dimensions. And each evolution asked more of a plant that was already working at the limit of its geometry. Ford's engineers knew this. Ford's planners knew this. And somewhere in Dearborn, Michigan, Ford's strategists filed it away. In 2002, Ford stopped producing passenger cars in the United Kingdom entirely. The Escort, the Fiesta, the Focus, all shifted to continental European plants or to global supply chains. The Transit became the last Ford vehicle manufactured in Britain. Southampton was now not merely a van plant. It was the entirety of Ford's British manufacturing identity. That should have made it untouchable. It did not. The 5 millionth Transit rolled off the Southampton line on July 18, 2005, and was donated to a British charity. It was a good day. Photographs, speeches, a moment of pride for workers who had spent decades on that floor. Ford celebrated alongside them. What Ford did not mention was that, for several years, its European planning division had been quietly evaluating an alternative. A newer facility, a lower-cost workforce, a factory in a country where the wages were a fraction of what Southampton paid. The trap was not the motorway to the north, or the railway to the west, or the graveyard to the east. The trap was the spreadsheet in Dearborn. The city of Kocaeli sits on the eastern shore of the Sea of Marmara, an hour's drive from Istanbul. It is an industrial city, refineries, chemical plants, car factories, built on the logic that land is cheap, labor is cheaper, and the government in Ankara is eager for foreign investment. In the early 2000s, Ford chose Kocaeli as the site for its next major European manufacturing operation. The plant was run through Ford Otosan, a joint venture with a Turkish partner. It was modern, purpose-built, and designed from the ground up for high-volume van production. Nobody in Southampton was told. The Kocaeli plant began producing Transits in 2002, initially absorbing production that had previously run through Ford's Genk factory in Belgium. Ford presented this as a routine consolidation, European capacity being rationalized, nothing to concern the British workforce. Southampton continued running. The orders kept coming. The line kept moving. Workers had no particular reason to look toward Turkey and worry, but the numbers told a different story. At its height, Southampton had produced 75,000 Transits a year. By 2008, that figure had fallen to 66,000. The market was softening, Ford explained. The global financial crisis was hitting van sales across Europe. Reasonable enough. What Ford did not explain was that Kocaeli was simultaneously ramping up, absorbing volume that, in an earlier decade, would have gone to Swaythling. Then 2009 arrived, and the mask slipped. With the Kocaeli plant now running at full capacity, Ford made its move. Production at Southampton was cut in half. The workforce, which had already been reduced from its 1980s peak, dropped to just over 500 people, all operating on a single shift. The factory that had once run around the clock, that had filled its car parks before sunrise, now sat half-empty on a site built for 10 times the activity. 500 workers, one shift, a plant designed for thousands. And yet, in that same year, 2009, The 6 millionth Ford Transit was built. Not at Coachella, at Southampton. The milestone was celebrated with the appropriate corporate fanfare. Ford executives spoke warmly of the plant's heritage. Workers posed for photographs beside the commemorative van. The ceremony was genuine in its way. 6 million vehicles is an extraordinary achievement for any single factory. But it carried an undertone that nobody in management chose to address directly. The van that made the milestone was built by a workforce that had just been halved. The plant that achieved the record was running at a fraction of its capacity, and the factory in Turkey was 4 times larger than Southampton and growing. Ford's official position was that Southampton remained a valued part of its European operation. The chassis cab variant of the Transit, a specialist configuration used for ambulances, horsebox conversions, and light commercial bodies, would continue to be built at Swaythling. There was a future here, Ford insisted. A smaller future, yes, a more focused future, but a future nonetheless. Workers chose to believe it. What else could they do? In September 2011, Ford of Europe made it official. A formal announcement confirmed that Southampton would continue producing the short and medium wheelbase Transit, along with the Tornado minibus variant, for at least another 2 years. More than that, the plant was designated as the European Centre for the chassis cab version of the next generation Transit. Production would be ramped up to 35,000 units a year. The future was not just secure, it was expanding. Unite, the union representing Southampton's workers, welcomed the announcement cautiously. The workforce had been through enough uncertainty to know that corporate statements were not the same as binding commitments. But the language from Ford was specific. There were numbers attached. There was a product. There was a timeline. Men and women who had been watching the plant shrink for 2 years allowed themselves, carefully, to exhale. Some of them made decisions based on what Ford had said. Mortgages were extended. Children were enrolled in local schools on the assumption that the family would not be moving. Workers who had been quietly weighing redundancy chose to stay, reassured that the next model cycle would bring new work to Swaythling. The announcement had done what Ford intended it to do. It stabilized the workforce, reduced anxiety, and kept experienced hands on the line. What the workforce did not know, what no one in Southampton had been told, was that 4 months earlier, in June 2011, Ford's European Planning Division had already begun evaluating a scenario in which Southampton closed entirely, and they did not know something else. In June 2012, the European Investment Bank approved a loan of £80 million to Ford Otosan, the Turkish joint venture, to modernize and expand the Kocaeli facility. The loan was backed, in part, by guarantees from European Union member states. The United Kingdom was among them. British taxpayers were guaranteeing a loan to build the factory that would replace British workers. The loan was signed, the money moved. The Turkish plant began its expansion, and in Southampton, on the shop floor of a factory that had been told its future was secure, nobody knew that the clock had already started. Conservative MP Caroline Noakes, whose constituency covered Southampton, would later stand in the House of Commons and ask the question that cut to the heart of it. Why, she demanded, does a subsidiary of a company making $2.2 billion in profit need cheap loans from UK taxpayers to export UK jobs to a country that is still outside the European Union? Ford's answer was that the EIB loan was at commercial rates and did not constitute taxpayer subsidy in any meaningful sense. The workers of Swaythling were not in a position to debate the technicalities of European investment banking. They were about to get a phone call. October 26, 2012 began like any other Friday at the Swaythling plant. The single shift clocked in. The line ran. Transits moved through the paint shop and down the assembly bays in the same sequence they had followed for 40 years. Outside, it was an ordinary autumn morning in Hampshire. Then the meeting was called. Management summoned union representatives to a room and delivered the news without ceremony. The Southampton plant would close in July 2013. All transit production for Europe would be consolidated at Kocaeli, Turkey. The Dagenham stamping plant, which supplied most of the sheet steel panels for Southampton's body shop, would close at the same time. Together, the two announcements would eliminate 1,500 Ford jobs directly, with the wider impact on suppliers and the local economy estimated at 11,000 positions. 9 months. That was what Ford was offering. 9 months between the announcement and the end. Word spread through the factory within the hour. Workers who had been on the line that morning stood in small groups, phones in hand, calling wives, calling parents, calling sons who worked the same shift. The atmosphere, by every account, was not loud. It was the particular quiet of people absorbing something they had feared but had chosen not to believe. Unite, Britain's largest trade union, responded the same day. The language was unambiguous. Ford, the union said, had betrayed its workforce and its loyal customer base. The announcement had been handled disgracefully. The union vowed to fight the closures. Len McCluskey, Unite's general secretary, placed the decision in its broader context. There had been over 50,000 Ford workers in the United Kingdom in 2000. If Southampton and Dagenham stamping closed, barely a fifth of that number would remain. The politicians were faster than usual. Alan Whitehead, Labour MP for Southampton Test, condemned the decision within hours. This, he said, was a genuine and devastating blow to Southampton's economy, reached, apparently, without discussion or consultation. He called on the government to explain what it had known and when. The answer, it emerged, was embarrassing. Vince Cable, the business secretary, admitted publicly that he had been kept in the dark. The government had learned of the closure from the same announcement Ford made to the unions and the press. A corporation had just eliminated the last vehicle assembly operation in Britain and neglected to mention it to the minister responsible for British industry. But the detail that landed hardest, the one that moved the story from corporate disappointment to something closer to betrayal, was the share price. In the hours following Ford's announcement, as 500 workers in Southampton absorbed the news that their livelihoods were gone, Ford's share price climbed. It moved from £10.36 to £11.16. The markets, in their clean and impersonal way, had welcomed the decision. The elimination of jobs in Hampshire was good for shareholders. The arithmetic was simple and merciless. A company making $2.2 billion in global profit had just decided that Southampton was no longer worth keeping. And Wall Street applauded. The morning after the announcement, the full shape of what Ford had done began to come into focus. Unite's Deputy Regional Secretary Vince Passfield pointed out something that had received little attention in the initial coverage. Ford was closing 2 British plants simultaneously, Southampton and Dagenham stamping, but offering different redundancy terms to the workers at each. Southampton's package exceeded Dagenham's. Workers at Dagenham, already in one of London's most economically deprived areas, were receiving less. Passfield's phrase was exact and unsparing. Workers, he said, were being treated as second-class citizens. Shop steward Dominic O'Callaghan went further. His union, he said, had been kept in the dark throughout. From the moment of the announcement, they had been chasing Ford for basic information, timelines, terms, which jobs might be saved, and still had not received straight answers. The closure had been decided in boardrooms Ford workers had never entered, in a language that was not English, on a spreadsheet that had never once mentioned the name of anyone on the Swaythling floor. Plant convener Mark Stevens identified the specific human cost that the headline numbers obscured. 120 toolmakers at Southampton would not find suitable alternative employment at the engine plant next door. These were skilled tradespeople, precision workers whose expertise had taken years to develop and whose qualifications did not translate easily to a different kind of factory. Ford had promised redeployment. For the toolmakers, the promise was hollow. Meanwhile, in the House of Commons, the debate about the EIB loan was sharpening into something that Ford had not anticipated. It had emerged that in June 2012, 4 months before the closure announcement, and mere weeks after Ford had been awarded Regional Growth Fund money from the British government, the European Investment Bank had approved an £80 million loan to Ford Otosan in Turkey. The loan was guaranteed in part by European Union member states, including the United Kingdom. Caroline Noakes, the Conservative MP for Romsey and Southampton North, brought the full absurdity of the situation before Parliament in terms that required no elaboration. By guaranteeing the loan, she said, the UK taxpayer had helped Turkey import British jobs at the expense of the UK taxpayer. Ford had a duty to show moral responsibility toward those who had just subsidized their own redundancy. Ford's response was careful and corporate. The EIB loan, a spokeswoman explained, was at commercial rates and did not use taxpayer money in any direct sense. The loan was intended to modernize the Turkish factory for production of new car models, not specifically to absorb Southampton's output. The Kocaeli plant, she added, had 4 times Southampton's capacity and had led global transit production for a decade. Consolidation there was simply efficient. The workers of Swaythling were not moved by the distinction between direct and indirect subsidy. What they understood, what any reasonable person understood, was this. Ford had accepted British government money. Ford had accepted a loan guaranteed in part by British taxpayers. And Ford had used the period during which it was receiving that support to plan the elimination of its last British vehicle assembly operation, without telling the government, without telling the union, and without telling the 500 people who came to work every morning and built the van that Ford itself called the backbone of Britain. The question was no longer whether Southampton could be saved. It could not. The question was what the fight would look like, and whether anyone in power would have the stomach to wage it. The protest outside Ford's UK headquarters in November 2012 was not a large one by the standards of British industrial action, but it had a quality that larger demonstrations sometimes lack, a focused, personal fury that comes from people who know exactly what they have lost and exactly who is responsible. Workers from Southampton stood alongside colleagues from Dagenham, many of them wearing Unite insignia, carrying placards that quoted Ford's own marketing language back at the company. One Ford, one plan, one goal. Someone had written underneath, one question, is the goal to close all UK Ford plants? It was a good line. It did not change anything. Inside Ford's offices, the company maintained its position with the consistency of an organization that had already made its decision and was now managing the aftermath rather than reconsidering it. The closure was commercially necessary. The Turkish plant was more efficient. The differential in labor costs was too large to bridge. Southampton's production could be absorbed at Kocaeli without disruption to customers. Ford regretted the impact on workers and families and would work constructively with unions to ensure the best possible outcomes. The union's response was to ballot for strike action. Unite's policy, long established, was that a threatened plant closure triggered a national strike ballot across the company. McCluskey had signalled his support. Shop stewards at Southampton were in favour. The logic was straightforward. A strike ballot, and the credible threat of coordinated industrial action across Ford's remaining British operations was the only leverage the workforce possessed. Ford's engine plants at Dagenham and Bridgend employed thousands of workers. A united stoppage would cost Ford far more than the redundancy packages it was offering. But the ballot faced a structural problem that no amount of solidarity could overcome. Ford had built its redundancy offer carefully. The packages on the table at Southampton were, by the standards of British manufacturing closures, generous. Workers who accepted terms received payouts that reflected their years of service, topped up beyond statutory minimums, in ways that made the decision to fight financially costly on a personal level. A worker with 20 years on the line, facing a generous package on one hand and an uncertain strike on the other, was being asked to gamble a known sum against an unknowable outcome. Some chose the package, others held out. The unity that a successful ballot required began to fracture at the edges, not from cowardice, but from the entirely rational calculations of people with mortgages and children, and no other major employer within reasonable distance of Swaythling. The 400 contract workers had no such calculation to make. They were not eligible for Ford's redundancy terms at all. For them, there was only statutory redundancy, a fraction of what permanent employees would receive. Their anger was unambiguous and uncomplicated. They had nothing to lose by fighting and nothing to gain by accepting. But contract workers do not drive strike ballots, and Ford knew it. Solidarity came from an unexpected direction. At the Genk factory in Belgium, which Ford had announced for closure on the same week as Southampton, workers had responded with a blockade. They occupied the site, prevented vehicles from leaving, and organized a mass solidarity demonstration that drew Ford workers from across Europe. Representatives from Southampton and Dagenham traveled to Genk in November 2012, standing alongside Belgian colleagues in a show of cross-border union unity that Ford's communications team had clearly not anticipated. It was genuine. It was moving. It was also, in the end, insufficient. Ford had made its calculation years before the announcement. The Turkish plant was built. The capacity was in place. The financial modeling had been completed and approved at the highest levels of the company. No strike ballot, however credible, was going to reverse a decision that had taken a decade to engineer. Southampton could shut down production tomorrow, and the transits would still roll out of Coachella next week. You cannot strike your way out of a factory that already exists in another country. By the early months of 2013, the fight was entering its final stage. The strike ballot had not delivered the unified action that union leaders had hoped for. Enough workers had accepted redundancy terms, or were weighing acceptance seriously enough, that the momentum for industrial action never reached critical mass. The national union infrastructure remained supportive in principle. In practice, the window for a fight that could actually stop the closure was closing. What remained was the negotiation of terms, the granular, exhausting work of extracting the best possible outcome from a corporation that held all the significant cards. How much for each year of service? What counted as suitable alternative employment? Whether the toolmakers would receive additional support? Whether the 400 contractors would receive any improvement on statutory minimums? Mark Stevens, the plant convener, pushed on every front. His frustration was not with the union's national leadership, who had been supportive, but with Ford's fundamental unwillingness to engage with the human specificity of what they were doing. A company this size, with profits of this magnitude, closing a plant this profitable, because profitable it was, even at half capacity, had choices about how it treated the people it was discarding. Ford was making those choices with one eye permanently on cost. Roger Madison, Unite's national officer, called Ford's treatment of the workers disgraceful. Outside the plant, Southampton's economic planners were already thinking past the closure. The city council announced a task force to support affected workers. Retraining programs were discussed. The idea that the site might become a training facility was floated, and immediately condemned by union representatives as an insult, a capitulation dressed up as a plan, offered before the fight had even been properly joined. Richard Williams, the Labour leader of Southampton City Council, bore the brunt of that anger. The unions were right to push back. Announcing a transition plan before exhausting every avenue of resistance sent exactly the wrong signal to Ford. That the city had already accepted the outcome and was moving on. The city had not accepted it. But it had begun, quietly, to prepare for it, because the math was not on Southampton's side, and everyone in the room knew it. Ford's labour costs in Turkey were 1/3 of those in Hampshire. The Coachella plant had 4 times Southampton's production capacity. Ford had just reported a pre-tax loss of over $1 billion for the first 9 months of 2012 in its European operations alone. The company was not inventing a crisis. The European car market was genuinely contracting. But contraction does not explain every decision. It provides cover for decisions that were always going to be made, decisions rooted not in necessity but in preference. Ford preferred cheaper. Ford preferred Turkey. Ford preferred the earnings per share that a leaner European operation would deliver. To shareholders who had never set foot in Swaythling, and never would. The factory floor knew all of this. They had known it, in some form, since 2009, when the line went to 1 shift and 500 people where 4,500 had stood before. What came next was not a surprise, it was just the end. There is a particular quality to work that is being done for the last time. The workers who returned to the Swaythling floor in November 2012, after the announcement and the protests and the union meetings, understood something that is difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. Every transit that moved down the line from that point forward was countable. Finite. There would be a last one, and they would know it when it came. The knowledge did not stop the line. It did not slow the pace or reduce the quality. These were professional people who had spent careers learning to build a van correctly, and they built it correctly until the last day. But the knowledge was there, underneath everything, changing the texture of ordinary work. The redundancy process ran in parallel with production throughout the winter and into spring. Ford's offer separated the workforce into those who would accept voluntary redundancy, those who would take early retirement, and those who would seek redeployment to other Ford facilities. The redeployment options were real but limited. A new £12 million vehicle distribution centre was being established at Southampton docks. Ford was investing in the port operation even as it closed the factory. A vehicle refurbishment facility would operate on part of the old plant site, employing 134 people. Ford's engine plants at Bridgend in South Wales and Dagenham in East London would absorb some of the workforce. For workers willing to relocate, there were options. For workers who had spent 30 years in Swaythling, whose children were in school in Southampton, whose parents lived nearby, whose entire social geography was contained within a few miles of Wide Lane, relocation to Bridgend or Dagenham was not a practical alternative. It was a corporate courtesy extended in the knowledge that most people would not take it. The 400 contractors remained the most exposed. Their statutory redundancy entitlements were a fraction of the packages being offered to permanent employees. Ford had structured its workforce over the years in ways that insulated the company from the full cost of a closure, contracting out roles that, in an earlier era, would have been permanent positions. The toolmakers Mark Stevens had identified were in a similarly difficult position. Their skills were specific and deep. There was no obvious local employer who needed precisely what they knew how to do. Through the early months of 2013, sections of the factory began going dark. The decommissioning did not wait for the final day. As production was wound down by variant and model, the equipment serving those lines was switched off, tagged for disposal, and in some cases sold. The factory shrank from the inside, whole buildings going silent, while adjacent ones continued running, the noise and activity of a working plant contracting toward a diminishing core. Workers who had navigated the same routes for decades found themselves walking past locked doors and empty bays that had been full of colleagues 6 months before. It had the quality of a slow erasure. The line that remained running built chassis cab transits, the specialist variant that Ford had, as recently as 18 months earlier, promised would be the foundation of Southampton's future. The irony was not lost on anyone. The van that was supposed to save the plant was now the last van it would ever build. July 15, 2013. The last Ford Transit entered the production line at Swaythling. It was a chassis cab variant, white, as most of them were. It moved into the body shop, where workers who had been performing the same sequence of operations for years guided it through the welding stations with the same precision they brought to every vehicle. There was no ceremony at this stage. The van did not know it was the last. The machines did not know. Only the people knew, and they kept working. Outside, Southampton was going about its summer. The airport beside the plant was handling its usual traffic. Cars moved along the M27 to the north. The railway ran trains past the western boundary on its schedule. The city that had grown up alongside this factory, that had taken its rhythm partly from the shift changes and the car park filling and emptying on Wide Lane, did not pause to mark the moment. Life has that quality. It continues on the periphery of endings that feel, to those inside them, like the whole world stopping. 11 days later, on July 26, 2013, the van was finished. It came off the line in the late morning. The workers who had built it, who had welded its body, painted its panels, fitted its glass and its seats and its instruments, gathered around it in the way that workers at closing plants have gathered around final vehicles since the first factory ever shut its gates. They signed their names on the bodywork. Dozens of signatures spread across the white panels, each one representing a person and a working life, and a connection to this place that no redundancy package could adequately compensate. The signatures would not survive long. The van was a production vehicle, not a monument. It would be delivered, used, worn out, and eventually scrapped in the ordinary way of working vehicles. But in that moment, on that floor, the signatures meant something to the people who made them. They were a record, a proof of presence. We were here. We built this. This was ours. David Higgins, who had spent 30 years on that floor, who had welded body shells in Building B and C, who had learned the plant's rhythms through 3 decades of shift changes and model updates and corporate announcements, walked out of the factory on July 26, 2013, and did not go back. He was not alone. 500 people walked out that day, or had already walked out in the months prior, as sections closed around them. Some went to Bridgend, some went to Dagenham, some took their packages and looked for work in a Southampton economy that had just lost its largest manufacturing employer. Some retired earlier than they had planned, on terms that reflected the abruptness of the ending rather than the length of the commitment. The machines fell silent. The paint shop, 6 stories of it, the vertical marvel that engineers had built because there was no room to go sideways, went dark for the first time since 1972. The welding bays that had produced 2 million, then 4 million, then 6 million transit bodies, cooled and quieted. The car park on Wide Lane, which had once filled before dawn with the vehicles of 4,500 workers arriving for the early shift, held nothing but the cars of the small refurbishment operation that would occupy a corner of the site. Ford issued a statement. The company thanked its Southampton workforce for decades of dedicated service. It expressed confidence in the future of the transit as a product and in Ford's ongoing commitment to the United Kingdom through its engine manufacturing operations at Dagenham and Bridgend. The Transit was still the best-selling van in Britain. It would now be built in Turkey. The demolition of the Ford Southampton plant did not happen immediately. For a time, the buildings stood as they had always stood, the 6-story paint shop visible from the M27, the welding bays dark behind their corrugated walls, the car park empty. The site that had defined the northeastern edge of Swaythling for 74 years sat in a state of suspended disbelief, as if the city itself had not yet decided what to do with the fact of it. The human cost settled in faster than the buildings came down. 500 direct Ford jobs were gone. But the number that mattered more, the number that never appeared in the headline announcements, was the one attached to the 81 suppliers who had fed components and materials into the Swaythling line for decades. Rubber seals and wiring looms, seat assemblies and dashboard panels, fasteners and fluid systems, an entire ecosystem of smaller manufacturers whose order books had been built around the assumption that Southampton would keep running. When the line stopped, their contracts stopped with it. The ripple moved outward through the Hampshire economy in ways that were diffuse and therefore easy to ignore. A few dozen jobs here, a small factory reducing its shift there, a family business losing its anchor customer quietly and without ceremony. The total estimate, direct jobs, contractor positions, supplier redundancies, and the broader economic displacement ran to 11,000. 11,000 people whose working lives were altered by a decision made in Dearborn, Michigan, on the basis of a labor cost differential that Ford's own executives admitted could not be bridged. The workers who had transferred to Bridgend carried the closure with them like luggage. They had been the lucky ones, redeployed rather than made redundant, still employed by Ford, still building engines in a Welsh factory that Ford had described as a core part of its European manufacturing strategy. They had relocated their families, enrolled their children in new schools, bought or rented homes in South Wales, on the reasonable assumption that Bridgend represented stability. Claire Shortland was 47 years old when Bridgend was announced for closure in 2019. She had worked for Ford for 27 years. She had been a supervisor at Southampton when that plant closed, and she had made the journey to Wales rather than take her redundancy. She spoke to journalists with a directness that cut through every piece of corporate language Ford had deployed across 2 decades. She had been at Southampton when they shut there, she said. And it was a particular kind of insult to find out about Bridgend from the press. She did not know what she was going to do. Len McCluskey, Unite's General Secretary, provided the obituary that Ford's own communications team would never write. Ford, he said in 2019, had broken promise after promise to the United Kingdom. The company had deliberately run down its British operations over years and decades, each closure presented as a rational response to market conditions, each one in reality a step in a longer retreat. And now the retreat was complete. Not a single Ford vehicle, car or van, was manufactured anywhere in Britain. The backbone of Britain was built elsewhere now. The wide lane site was cleared over several years. By 2017, the developer Mount Park had acquired the land and begun work on a logistics and warehousing park, the kind of low-margin, high-volume distribution infrastructure that had come to replace manufacturing across swathes of southern England. The 6-story paint shop, the welding bays, the assembly lines that had produced 6 million transits, all of it gone. In its place, long rectangular warehouses served by articulated lorries on a road network that the M27 had made convenient for distribution, if not for manufacturing. The irony required no elaboration. The vans that once left this site, built now arrived here in containers, having been assembled in Turkey, to be processed and dispatched to British customers who had no particular reason to know or care about the difference. The Ford Transit is still the best-selling commercial vehicle in Britain. It has held that position every single year since 1965. 59 consecutive years of market leadership, a record that no other van, British or foreign, has come close to matching. In 2024 alone, more than 96,000 transits were sold in the United Kingdom, accounting for more than a quarter of the entire light commercial vehicle market. Builders still load them before dawn. Delivery drivers still navigate housing estates in them. Ambulance services still convert chassis cab variants into vehicles that keep people alive. The van that Ford called the backbone of Britain is still the backbone of Britain. It is built in Turkey. Every transit sold in the United Kingdom today generates revenue for Ford Motor Company, profits that flow to shareholders in Dearborn and to the Ford Otosan joint venture in Kocaeli. A portion of that revenue was once wages in Swaythling, the money that paid the mortgages on streets within walking distance of Wide Lane, that filled the shops and pubs and schools of a working-class neighborhood that had organized its entire economic life around a factory that no longer exists. That money goes somewhere else now. What is most striking, in retrospect, is not the closure itself but the completeness of the surrender that followed it. Ford did not close Southampton and invest in a different British facility. Ford did not develop a new product for British manufacture. Ford did not respond to the loss of Southampton with any gesture toward the country whose market remained its largest in Europe. The withdrawal was total and permanent. Bridgend followed in 2019. The engine plants that survived Southampton's closure did not survive the decade. By the time Len McCluskey spoke those words in 2019, not a single Ford vehicle made in the UK. The process that had begun with the quiet construction of a factory in Kocaeli had reached its logical conclusion. A corporation had decided, over the course of roughly 20 years, that Britain was a market worth selling to, but not a country worth manufacturing in. The decision was not announced as a policy. It was implemented as a series of individually justifiable commercial choices, each one defensible in isolation, each one a step in the same direction. Southampton was not the beginning of that story, but it was the moment when the story became impossible to misread. The plant at Swaythling survived German bombing raids in 1940 because the people inside it understood what they were defending and refused to stop. It did not survive the Ford Motor Company's quarterly earnings targets because the people inside it, for all their skill and commitment and decades of loyalty, had no equivalent weapon to use in return. You cannot weld your way out of a boardroom decision. You cannot assemble your way back from Turkey. The machines that built 6 million transits are gone. The buildings that house them are gone. The workforce that operated them for half a century has scattered to other factories, to other trades, to retirement, to the particular silence that settles over skilled people when the work that defined them disappears. What remains is the van itself, still white, still everywhere, still doing the work it has always done. Still the backbone of something. Just not ours anymore.